Who killed Epstein? Not shouted, not repeated, just 4 words. And in that moment, Pam Bondii froze, because that question was never supposed to be asked on live television, and it definitely wasn't supposed to be answered. She had survived Florida courtrooms, national campaigns, and confirmation hearings that would have broken lesser politicians. 47 minutes earlier, Kennedy had not asked a single thing about Epstein. He let the room relax first. He let Bondi think this hearing was still under control. And when Kennedy finally leaned into the microphone, the entire chamber went still, not the polite quiet of a formal proceeding, the breathless, instinctive silence that humans feel right before something irreversible happens. Kennedy didn't start with Epstein. He started with something much smaller, something that looked harmless, but it wasn't. Not with budgets, not with border policy, not with the standard Washington theater that Bondi had spent weeks preparing for. He started with a judge in Wisconsin. Attorney General, Kennedy said, his Louisiana drawl slow and deliberate, like a man who had all the time in the world. This judge they arrested in Wisconsin. She was breaking federal law, wasn't she? Bondi nodded carefully, confirming it. She was helping an undocumented immigrant escape federal custody. The arrest was lawful. Bondi answered quickly, too quickly, like someone trying to move past something before anyone noticed. Kennedy smiled, and that smile made 2 Democratic staffers in the 3rd row exchange a nervous glance, because they recognized it. Kennedy wasn't asking about the judge, he was building something, and every question was another brick in a wall that Bondi couldn't yet see, but was about to walk straight into. As Americans, Kennedy continued, his voice still unhurried, do we get to pick and choose which laws we follow? Bondi said, no, of course not. If you're an attorney general, do you get to decide you don't want to answer certain questions before Congress? Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She said no again. Equal treatment under the law. But that's when everything changed. Because Bondi had just locked herself into an answer. She wouldn't be able to escape. And now, all Kennedy had to do was apply that rule to her. Now came the pivot. Attorney General Bondi, Kennedy said, reaching for something beneath the table. Then Kennedy said a name that instantly changed the temperature of the room. Jeffrey Epstein. It wasn't a question. Bondi's fingers, which had been resting loosely on the table, pressed flat against the surface. A prosecutor watching from the press gallery later said it was the first tell, that subtle, involuntary press of the palms, the body trying to anchor itself before the mind even processes the threat. Yes, Senator, Bondi said, I do. You committed to full transparency on the Epstein files, complete disclosure. Those were your exact words. Kennedy paused, letting it breathe. Then the Justice Department released a fraction of what was in those files, a carefully selected fraction. He looked up from his notes. What happened to complete disclosure, Attorney General? Kennedy flipped to the next page. How many people has your department re-interviewed about Epstein's death since you took office? Bondi didn't answer right away. How many guards? How many supervisors? How many officials who signed off on the original timeline? Because if no one was re-questioned, then nothing was re-examined. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The implication was already clear. Either the investigation had been reopened, or Bondi had accepted the original version without touching it. The room went still again. Because now this wasn't about old files anymore. It was about whether Bondi had actually done anything at all. Bondi reached for process again, reviews, procedures, ongoing coordination. But Kennedy had already exposed the real problem. If no one had been re-questioned, then all Bondi was protecting was the old story. Bondi answered immediately. Legal language procedures, technical explanations, but none of it answered the question. She cited court orders, grand jury secrecy rules, victim privacy protections, technically careful, completely evasive. Kennedy didn't blink. Attorney General, I want to ask you something very direct. He set down his pen. When Kennedy sets down his pen, people pay attention. Jeffrey Epstein died in a federal facility, a facility under the supervision of your department, under the supervision of every attorney general before you. He leaned forward slightly. Did Jeffrey Epstein hang himself? The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds where you could hear the ventilation system humming above the Senate chamber. 11 seconds where Bondi's face cycled through something that looked like calculation, then composure, then the careful assembly of an answer that could not be the truth everyone in that room was actually listening for. Senator, she said finally, the official finding was suicide by hanging. That is the determination that was reached by... That's not what I asked you. Kennedy's voice didn't rise. That was the terrifying part. He stayed completely calm. I asked if you believe he hung himself, you personally, the Attorney General of the United States, who controls the files, who controls the investigation, who told the American people she would give them the full truth. He tilted his head slightly. Do you believe it? Bondi's mouth opened, closed. She reached for her water glass, a movement so controlled it looked rehearsed, and yet her hand wasn't entirely steady. She took a measured sip, set the glass down, and gave an answer that was technically 17 words long and said absolutely nothing. A veteran reporter in the front row stopped typing. She later told colleagues that was the moment she knew something was wrong, not with Kennedy's question. With the answer Bondi refused to give, Kennedy wasn't finished. Your Justice Department, he continued, pulling a document from the folder, has been sitting on materials from the Epstein investigation for months. Materials that victims' advocates, legal experts, and members of this committee have formally requested. He held up a single page. This is a letter, Attorney General, sent to your office, dated 11 weeks ago, requesting a full accounting of what remains classified in the Epstein files and why. He placed it on the table between them like he was setting down a verdict. Has your office responded to this letter? The color that left Bondi's face in that moment, reporters would later argue about whether it happened before or after the question, was visible from the third row. Her chief of staff, seated directly behind her, pressed his lips together and looked at the floor. We are working through the appropriate channels to Attorney General. Kennedy's voice finally carried an edge, not anger, something colder than anger, the tone of a man who has already seen the ending and is simply walking her toward it. 11 weeks, and your office has not responded to a formal congressional request regarding the death of a man who trafficked children to some of the most powerful people on this planet. He paused. Does that sound like transparency to you? The room did not erupt. That's what people got wrong when they described what happened next. It didn't explode. It compressed, like the air was being slowly pressed out of the chamber, leaving something dense and airless in its place. 3 Republican senators who had been scrolling through their phones had gone completely still. A camera operator in the far corner slowly zoomed in on Bondi's face without being told to. Senator, Bondi said, and her voice had shifted. Still controlled, but carrying something underneath it now, something that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. The Epstein matter involves extraordinarily sensitive information, victims who deserve protection, ongoing legal considerations that... Then Kennedy looked straight at her and asked the one question she couldn't deflect. Who killed him? And those 4 words detonated in the Senate chamber like something dropped from a great height. Bondi stared at him. Her lips parted. No words came out. She looked down, then back up, buying time. But there was nothing left to say. The microphones caught a single breath. Nothing else. The press gallery was completely silent. Kennedy waited. Senator, the official determination. I know the official determination. He hadn't moved. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. I am asking you what you believe, because you have seen those files, Attorney General. You have access to information that the American people do not have. You promised them you would give them the truth. He let that word, truth, sit in the air between them. So I am asking you one more time, person to person, who killed Jeffrey Epstein? What Bondi said next will be argued about for years. It was not a confession. It was not a revelation. It was a careful, lawyerly non-answer that managed, through its very carefulness, to confirm exactly what Kennedy had spent the last 47 minutes building toward. She said she could not speak to matters still under review, which meant one thing. This case wasn't closed. Bondi wasn't hiding the truth. She was holding it. That was the tell. Not closed, not finished, not buried the way they wanted people to believe. Kennedy nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he already knew the answer before he asked the question. When do you think that review will be complete, Attorney General? Bondi straightened slightly. We are committed to a thorough and complete process that... Before I die? Kennedy asked pleasantly. The chamber broke, not in chaos, but in a sudden, involuntary exhale from 200 people simultaneously. Someone in the back actually laughed, sharp and disbelieving, then caught themselves. Bondi did not laugh. Kennedy looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked directly into the nearest camera with the expression of a man who has just finished saying everything he came here to say. Behind Bondi, one staffer stopped writing altogether. Another leaned in and whispered something no microphone could catch. Bondi didn't turn around. She just stared forward like she already knew the damage was done. The American people have been waiting for the truth about Jeffrey Epstein for a long time, Attorney General. They have been told to be patient. They have been told the process takes time. They have been told that proper procedures must be followed. He gathered his papers slowly. What they have not been told, what you have not told them today, is who is in those files, what those files contain, and why the most powerful law enforcement official in the United States cannot answer a simple question about whether the most famous prisoner in American history actually killed himself. He clicked his pen closed. I think they deserve an answer. I think you know what that answer is. He looked at her one final time. And I think the fact that you won't say it on live television tells us everything we need to know. The hearing continued for another 90 minutes. Other senators asked other questions. Bondi recovered and delivered measured answers on a dozen different topics. But nobody in that room was thinking about those other questions. They were thinking about 4 words. Who killed Jeffrey Epstein? And the answer Pam Bondii refused to give. So now I want to ask you something. Do you believe Epstein killed himself? Or was he silenced? Type suicide or type killed. And don't dodge it. Type suicide or type killed. Because if Bondi couldn't answer it clearly, the public should. Because silence like that doesn't happen without something being hidden.